Hello, I am Chauncey DeVega. You may recognize my voice from Ring of Fire Radio with Mike Papantonio, the BBC, Sirius XM, or the Tom Hartman Radio Show. And you may have read some of my essays at places like Salon and Alternet. I would like to thank all of you for listening to, downloading, tweeting, and sharing the eponymously named podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show.
And they ran a story by somebody named Chauncey DeVega.
Quote, I find black garbage pail kids, black conservatives, fascinating.
It's just unbelievable. You know,
he goes by the name of Chauncey DeVega.
You know, I've been called Uncle Tom, Oreo, sellout, shameless, but this is a new one.
Well, let's talk now to Chauncey DeVega.
As my man Chauncey DeVega of the blog We Are Respectable Negroes says,
I have author and blogger Chauncey DeVega here with us.
Hello and welcome to the Chauncey DeVega Show. Good show in store. Wonderful conversation with Claire Potter. You may know her from the Chronicle of Higher Education. She's a friend of the website. She's been so supportive, and she and I are going to sit down and talk about digital media, her new book on feminism and anti-pornography crusades, New York City, and I mean, you can hear it in my voice. So excited to have her on here, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful conversation. But, you know, writing online, and Claire and I have talked about this before, is a form of online and public archiving. It's also a journal of sorts. So if you listen carefully in the background, you will probably hear some thunder, some lightning. I got the whole Morpheus effect going on, and I usually edit that stuff out if there's any noise, but I'm going to leave stuff in for this episode of the podcast show. So on Tuesday, a story broke about another killing of an unarmed African American in South Carolina, a gentleman by the name of Walter Scott. And for the grace of God, go I or go thee, as they say. I mean, you see this thing where you have this white killer thug cop again shooting dead a black man who's running for his life. And there was a witness, Dominican brother. Thank goodness for him. I hope he stays safe. We recorded this, and, you know, you've seen him on MSNBC. And you just get tired sometimes. I mean, you know, a lot of good, wonderful supporters here on Warren and the podcast, ChaunceyDeVega.com, all that good stuff that, you know, the obligatory mentions, the pitches, getting the name out there X number of times, an episode to make sure it's in people's minds. And you guys keep me going, but I'm just like, man, I'm sure I'm not the only person who is not necessarily in the midst of racial battle fatigue. And I talk about this with some other guests too, but you see in the video over and over and over again, they keep showing this poor man getting killed. And it's the black super public, the late Richard Iton, and this idea that black private spaces are now public spaces, and they're now digital, and they're now global and international, and it's a spectacle. And it's almost, I know it's an imprecise statement, but I wrote about this on the website and elsewhere too. I mean, almost like lynching photography. They won't show, and somebody really pointed this out on Chauncey DeVega. I mean, we got some really smart commentators, man. Really smart people, and also at the Daily Kos, or Kos, however they pronounce it. I got a piece over there on the same subject, sort of writing from the heart, and writing about trying to figure out how conservatives will respond, white conservatives, to the killing of this poor man in cold blood on video. And that's, you know, thousands of people have read it, so be it. That you just wonder. I know it's so imprecise. You need to have the document, going back to the Black Super Republic, the idea that the black counterpublic doesn't exist, and these ideas circulate, that it's a spectacular image, and it's repeated over and 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 over again. God, we see the man die, you don't need to see it again. And it's a type of psychic terrorism, really. Lynching is a type of terrorism. These cops consistently killing black and brown folk, black men in particular, and black women who are unarmed, is a mental and psychic assault in the service of white supremacy as a cultural institution against people of color. And it's exhausting and it's tedious. And that's why you have to make sure that you take care of yourself, mental self-help, self-care, so that you don't go crazy. So back to the idea of the great commenters that we have here on ChaunceyDeVega.com. Somebody said, you know, they won't show ISIS videos of killing people. They bleep that out and black it out, but they will show this cop shooting this poor black man and leaving him dead. It just makes you wonder. I mean, and it's not a surprise too. I mean, I've on Twitter talking about this. Folks have been following me on Twitter and seconding and thirding and dozening some of my observations about this, because I've just been in a space, man. I've just been real and I've been honest. It's sometimes you sit down and you have to conquer the page. And what I had to write about that poor man being killed, that was just real. It took me about 10 minutes, and it was from the heart. And yeah, that doesn't change the world when we do that, online journaling and writing, but it does sort of locate you in a moment in space and time. And you're just like, why do we have to keep talking about this again? And going back to the idea of sort of insanity and how frustrating white supremacy can be, just like I'm sure sexism is to women, homophobia is to our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. And I made a joke, and I stand by it. I said, every time a white person says they're surprised by another black person being killed, and they don't believe us for centuries when we're talking about this, and now there's a video, we can't deny it, oh my God, the shock, the surprise. Where were you before when we were talking about it? Think we're crazy? God. Black folk, brown folk, our white brothers and sisters who know about this, who've been in the trenches with us, who have seen it with their own eyes, even when they second and third. I mean, there's the joke. Nobody believes it until a white man says it, right? But that's enough to make you insane too, isn't it? That is enough to make you insane. And I said they should put that in the DSM-4. Every time a white brother or sister says they're surprised by a cop killing somebody who's black and unarmed. And I had to get that off the chest. Just had to, because I know I'm not the only one who needed to make that exhalation. But again, my heart and my thoughts go out to that poor gentleman, Walter Scott, his family. And for that brother, that Dominican-American brother, please be careful. Go into hiding. Because that man is going to have to be looking over his shoulder for the rest of his natural life. Because the police do not forget. And I can hear the objections. Oh, police are heroes. Oh, don't hate on the good ones, Chauncey. Because you know when you're in trouble, you call them. I don't really call the cops. I'm not a big fan of the police. Frankly. I mean, you're a person of color, you know, especially as a black man or a black woman in certain neighborhoods, certain communities, even if you're rich, that when those police show up, it can easily make you into the criminal. I mean, had the great Nick Childs. If you haven't listened to that conversation with Nick Childs, we were talking about the criminal justice system and how to navigate and survive it as a black person. You check it out. It's one of our most popular podcasts. I might have to have Brother Childs on here again. And the piece I wrote, as I said, is on ChaunceyDeVega.com, and Alternet picked it up as well. Daily cost 9,000, 10, 11,000 Facebook shares or something. And on Fox News, I mean, it's priceless comedy gold, because even they are not trying to defend the indefensible. But even then, they fall into the muck and mire of racism. So they had one of their bloviators on the TV saying when he watches the video of Michael Scott being shot and killed by that thug cop, that he doesn't see a black man and a white man. He just sees a cop killing a human being. He must be colorblind or something. I mean, that's classic white racism, classic colorblind white racism. Another one, I think it was American Spectator, one of those right-wing sewers. They had an editorial on there for one of their writers talking about, well, here's an example where conservatives, we have to stand up, and this is horrible, and this is wrong, and there's no denying what happened. And of course, they throw the obligatory mention of the now sainted Darren Wilson. Again, a whole story there. I don't care what the FBI report says. They need to talk about the racist context that instigated the killing of Michael Brown for supposedly stealing, in quotation marks, some $10 cigarettes to smoke with, or cigarros, and they killed that poor boy in the street, the young man. So they try to write a piece. And here's, you can't roll around in filth, political feces, and then all of a sudden get clean. So in the post-civil rights era, conservatism and racism and white supremacy in America are one and the same thing. They are the same thing at this point. So now they're trying to have their come to Jesus moment, as the expression goes. And oh my God, this is a horrible thing. These cops killed this poor black man. This is unbelievable. We can't accept it. And then in the comments, you see them going all the way back to their same racist talking points. So the members of the tribe know exactly what's going on. And some of the common deflections you've seen was, well, the man shouldn't run. You never run from the cops. Well, you damn well better run from the cops these days. I think it was the Supreme Court justice said in many communities it's the norm to run from the cops, and it makes good sense. You can look up that decision. It was a few years ago. Or another one is Michael Scott owed child support, and he was a thug. You know the language. A criminal, he owed child support. And he's just trash, and he's a deadbeat. Shoot him. These are things in these comment sections. So the right wing in this country, the white right wing, has created a monster. They profit from it. They lay in the filth. They roll around in it, and then they want to throw their hands up. Oh my God. We're actually taking a principled stand. And that's why I talk to these homosexual types, the NRA, the right, white wing, conservatives. Where are they on this issue? Why aren't they going to black communities and having membership drives and saying, you all need to conceal carry, you all need to arm yourselves because your lives are imperiled. You're 20 sometimes more likely to be killed by the cops than a white person. It's happening all too often. There's a history of police violence. Never mind these quote-unquote principled conservatives and libertarians. Where the hell are they? We know where they are because they're in bed with white supremacy and racism. They should be saying, man, that's real tyranny. They're up there talking about tax cuts for the 1% and healthcare is tyranny, and you got people being killed through extrajudicial murder by police. They're silent as church mice. Again, where are their principles? Their principle is racism, and their principles is a double standard in terms of the lives, the safety, and the liberty of black and brown people in this country when threatened by police, because police do the day-to-day work of institutional racism. They are the long and the short arm of the law. And since the founding of this country, where police were used as slave patrollers, modern policing in America has its origins in slave patrols. They're just doing their job. They're just doing their job. So I always try to give love and to call attention to work that I think is particularly insightful, smart. When you read something, you'd be like, man, I wish I had written that. Give folks some shine. So there's, I occasionally read, doing my thinking, scratching beard moment there. Occasionally like to read and have some fun online. There's nothing fun about what's going on in this country, police violence against people of color, especially black men, unarmed black men. So there was a piece, as I pull it up on the computer machine. Folks got to bear with me. Got to bear with a brother as he gets his thoughts together on this. I try to be precise. And sometimes you just got to talk from the heart. So on the website, Deadspin, they have, I guess, a sub part of the site, a sub-site called The Concourse. And there's a really great article by Greg Howard, and it's called The Police Are America's Terrorists. I just want to read you 2 paragraphs. It's so spot on. And there's a wonderful graphic that shows a police officer shooting a black man. It's a black background, the brother's in red, and the cop is in white. Subtle and smart use of color. The semiotics of this image are so powerful. So on point. And when you use the word terrorism, I'm sure there are some people, like the ones who objected to my comparison with ISIS, about lynchings and burning alive people by ISIS and what the Klan did, and white mobs and white pogroms did, and their pogroms, white pogroms and their pogroms, did to black folks in this country by the thousands. The word terrorism. Well, terrorism is violence against civilians with the aim of creating terror to serve political ends. And sometimes terrorism can be state-sponsored, as in the case of the police, or by agents of the state, in the case of death squads in Latin and South America and elsewhere, Iraq. And in this country, in many communities, the police are terrorists. They are working to create a type of social control. They leave bodies in the street to intimidate. They use excessive force and brutality against the poor, against black people, against immigrants. And they kill with impunity to intimidate those communities. It's an extension and a function of custodial citizenship. They want you scared, they want you terrified, and they want you under control. That's terrorism. So there's a paragraph at the end here that's really, really, just potent. And I'll quickly read it because it's just so on point. Me stretching again. And this, most of all, is why a continual and ongoing and statistically rare type of slaughter qualifies as a type of terrorism. The actions of police represent the will of the government. The will of the government represents the will of the people. The actions of police, it follows, are the embodiment of public opinion. We can talk about Michael Slager, but he was, if almost certainly unwittingly, a tool. The issue is who wields him. As long as there have been white people and black people and brown people in America, the slaughter of black and brown people has been used as a form of control. For centuries, on a population level, the racial majority has voted and lobbied to give agents of the state more power to act without sanction, to militarize, to kill. Functionally, this has enabled them to wage war on behalf of the majority of the public, to express hatred and fear, and aspire to power through campaigns of terror and carnage. The slaughter of black and brown people is, in this light, a political act. Political violence enacted for political purposes against a civilian population to raise fear and obtain compliance. That Slager probably never thought of things in these terms doesn't matter. What does is that he was trained and given incentives in line with the interests of a particular class intent on preserving its power. The violence he enacted is a kind that keeps one class of citizens terrorized and fearful of random violence for the benefit of another. It's meant to keep that class in line and intact. Even as the sands of time shift and racial minorities slowly crawl towards majority status, it's little different from what we've seen in India or Israel, in Palestine or Ireland, a dominant class using the instruments of power against a subjugated one. It is, in essence, the final expression of an idea. Unlike people, ideas are impossible to kill. That's potent, man. That is on point. That is dense, and that is precise. And again, you can find that over on Concourse, which is on Deadspin.com, and it's called The Police Are America's Terrorists, and it's written by Greg Howard. Man, when you see somebody doing it that good, you see somebody writing that well, you just move aside and let them play the instrument. You just sit in and nod your head, and you don't cut them off. So that's just brilliant stuff from Greg Howard. So send him some views and some eyes on that great writing. And I had 3 questions, actually. Again, thinking about this murder recorded on video so people cannot deny it. Although the white racial paranoia gaze will come up with something. As some folk have joked, maybe they'll say Walter Scott was moonwalking towards the cop. Or black people's backs are very dangerous. Or they'll misinterpret the Supreme Court when it decided and said that when police use force against fleeing people, there's a very, very, very high standard of evidence to be reached. Even though the Ferguson prosecutor lied to the jury about what that verdict and that decision and that ruling actually said. That's a whole conversation about that hot mess in Ferguson. And congrats to the folks who won election there. I think there's 2 African Americans who got mobilized and got involved, and power resists change, and institutional power especially, but maybe they can get something done. Good luck to them. I mean that sincerely. But thinking about the media narrative, because of course, drive-by media, 24/7 news cycle in the land of false equivalency. You know and we know that now the next stage of the story, after outrage, after having talking to the family and the witness, is going to be, well, we have to hear the other side. Why would a good, reasonable police officer kill people? There has to be a reason. There has to be a reason that Walter Scott is dead. Let's figure it out. So they create the narrative of false equivalency, a false balance that exists in an ethical moral vacuum. So you know that's going to come. And then they're going to try to smear the witness. That's predictable too. The right wing, I'm sure, is going to do that. They got to complicate the story. It can't just be a simple narrative of right and wrong, good and evil. You don't shoot unarmed people dead, then plant a weapon on them, and then lie in the police report. And I want to know about that other cop who was there too. This is an institutional problem with corrupt cops, which is why I'm tired of folks saying, well, they're the good ones. Well, if you're part of a system that's corrupt and you look the other way and or you benefit from it, you're not good. They are guilty by association. They are guilty by tacit consent. They are guilty of implicit support, and they are guilty of active support of the criminal cops in their midst. You know something's wrong, you know it's rotten, and you're standing by and you're participating in it passively. You're giving your consent and you're covering. So I want to hear about this other couple, I believe was African American, who showed up on the scene. How did he write up his report? I heard he probably wrote some very vanilla, very basic supporting the other cops' lie, because blue comes before white and it comes before black. We know that. We know that. So some questions that won't be asked before we get to our great conversation. I mean, good conversation coming up. I mean, I learned a lot. You're going to learn a lot. It's just cool to talk to, as I always say, a fellow traveler, an interesting person doing interesting things. And she is number one prolific and just so accomplished and so very generous with her time as we talk about digital media and democracy, and my visit with Claire Potter's class and how we talked about blogging and online writing, all that good stuff. So here's some things that you're probably not going to hear from the mainstream media. I'm sure you guys who saw this horrible video picked up on some of the same questions that I had. So if you flash back a few months, iconic image, Darren Wilson standing over Michael Brown's dead body in the street, literally standing over it like he slayed a bear, like he killed a human being he was hunting. And I'm saying that, look at that picture. It's like a big game hunter. The way that the black body is bestialized and the way that he's looking at it with total indifference, like there's garbage laying in the street, the way that Darren Wilson looked at Michael Brown's body. Then you see this killer cop, this murderer, and I will define murder in the sense of based on what we saw in the video, his actions. He's been arrested, charged with murder. So we got the thug killer cop Michael Slager standing over the body of Mr. Walter Scott with total and utter indifference. Even soldiers in battle, and I wrote about this, on the website, and I wrote, 3 questions that the mainstream media won't ask about the killing of Walter Scott. Even soldiers in battle, when they have their first kill, even though they've been highly trained, their brains have been conditioned, they've been given all this muscle memory about how to shoot their weapons, multiple times. They've been taught to demean the other or to create cognitive distance between themselves and the target, the person they're killing. The cop is just looking down like nothing. He doesn't panic. He doesn't shake. Even soldiers, like I said, who kill people, they have a moment even afterwards where they may be upset. Not these cops. Look at him. If you look at the image in the video, like nothing. There's nothing. No response. And I was wondering, we got 3 possibilities here. Or maybe 4, maybe 5. But I narrowed it down to 3 basic questions. It's like, number 1, is Slager's calm and cool and chill demeanor, is that just a reflection of programming? And people, don't forget now, police departments have been caught using images of black people as target practice. Actual photographs of black people as target practice. So is it just, I guess, some sort of operant conditioning? Did they get the technical term right? Somebody who knows about psychology can email me. So is it just he's so well trained to kill that it's just like hitting a target and, so be it. His brain doesn't even respond. His emotions don't even respond about killing black people. Second possibility. Are Slager and the other cops who kill unarmed black people, just like we saw in this video, are they sociopathic? Now, sociopathy is different from psychopathy. Do they have flat affect? Do they lack emotion? Do they mimic emotions as opposed to actually feeling them? Do they have a problem forming attachments with others? You can go down the list of these traits we would associate. Are they antisocial with sociopathy? Maybe they're sociopathic. That's a scary thought. You think about all these cops out here with military training who may have their own personal issues, who don't deal well with emotions or anger. Folks have written about this with cops, who are heavily armed, who are empowered by the state to kill, who may have sociopathic impulses. Never mind their authoritarian personality, and I've written about that too, and others have. Police have authoritarian personalities. That's why they're attracted to the job. They get a gun and they get a badge. It's good pay. It's probably the best pay someone without a college degree can get, and they get the power to kill you. And then the final question, and this is another provocative one. The cop who killed Walter Scott. Think about this now. He's so calm, he's so cool, he's so collected, he takes the dumb gat that he keeps, he probably has a dumb gat somewhere. That's the gun that cops would throw near a body to get a clean kill. This time he uses a taser because he made up a fiction about a taser, and a taser's taken, oh my God. And that begs questions about, does a taser constitute lethal force enough for you to shoot somebody? Whole question there. So has Michael Slager, has he killed somebody before? Think about this. He doesn't react. It's like taking out the garbage. Calm, cool, and collective. Maybe he's killed somebody before. I don't know. This was just an old habit. And that's something to think about. So somebody pointed out to me, again, thinking about the frightening ironies or the frightening cultural narrative here that protects the myths that protect cops. And says they're all heroes and they're all our saviors and they should all be respected. And police are these demigods. They're just people. Some are good and many are bad. That you can go online and there are websites that track every cop ever killed in this country. Somebody's told me back to the 19th or 18th century, maybe farther back, probably, even constables before that. But the police don't even record the number of people they kill. There is no properly maintained, thorough, accurate national database because it's self-reported data from the police of all the people they've killed. Got a lot of work to do in this country. A lot of work. And our white brothers and sisters, the folks who listen who happen to be white to the podcast, they're self-selecting, right? They're already probably tuned and on the right side of history on these issues. But for those white folk, because you have a unique responsibility here, because your white brothers and sisters, your family members will not listen to black and brown people when we tell them the truth. You have, if you want to be a moral person, going back to one of my favorite guests, former freedom rider, and very kind to the website. I want to send him out some love. I mean, good people. When he asked, what sort of white person do you want to be? Ask yourself that. What sort of white person do you want to be? Most of the white brothers and sisters who are fans of the website, follow my work, they probably already answered that question. But for those who have not, or you have relatives or friends who happen to be white, because there's only one race, the human race. Race is a social construct. Whiteness is a social construct. White supremacy and whiteness are inventions. They are modern inventions. Work undercover. Make those interventions with your people, your kin, your folk who happen to be white, and do some pushback. And I warn you, they're going to be resistant. They may be angry. They may stop talking to you. Real anti-racist white brothers and sisters, they get a lot of grief. So you got to make that choice for yourself. But make those gentle interventions. Challenge some of those paradigms. Because remember, it's still an unfortunate truth that a lot of folk in this country will say it ain't true until a white person says it. They may not utter it, but they certainly think it. And never mind how they've been conditioned subconsciously to believe it. So Claire Potter, as I said, great guest. Claire is now at the New School in New York. She was at Wesleyan. She is an expert in American studies, professor of history, American cultural studies. She wrote an amazing and great book called, and one of my favorite books actually was really influential in some of my own work and my own thinking about certain topics. It's called War on Crime, Bandits, G-Men, and the Politics of Mass Culture. We're talking about her new work. She's working now in digital humanities, digital scholarship. She has a great new book coming out called Beyond Pornography, How Feminism Survived the Age of Reagan. And I've known her over the years, like I said, so kind, so helpful. She's helped to connect me to people who've been guests on the podcast before, the great Richard Slotkin being one of them. She writes for the Chronicle of Higher Ed, so she's right there on the cutting edge in terms of thinking about how do you think about public pedagogy? How do you think about teaching online? What's the future of the academy? She and I also just, have some fun here. And I mean, the conversation is just, again, not eerie, but it's like, again, and there's a distinction there. Again, not eerie. So she and I talked a few months ago, I'd have these wonderful conversations. And my motto is with folks, if you're thinking about doing a podcast or other stuff or interviews for your work, get folk while you can. You just record it and you put it away because people are busy. So she and I chatted right at the crescendo, so to speak, of what was going on in Ferguson and Eric Garner. So we're talking about Eric Garner and that decision, and the conversation could be insert another name, Walter Scott. Insert his name. I mean, you can insert another name again, Tamir Rice, Brother Crawford. We can go down the list of people. So there's that resonance there, that resonance of, we've talked about this again and it's still happening. And we also had some good times talking about New York City how Times Square became Disney World. And I, again, always trying to keep the memories of folk alive who live with us in the present, talking about my father going to New York and how my mother would be afraid of me going to New York because there were rapists, robbers, and thugs in Central Park and they would kill you. That was like in the 80s and 90s. And how New York has lost, Midtown, man, has lost so much personality. The Disneyfication of New York City. So we talk about that. We talk about tax policy in New York, where the nightclubs went. And I mean, we just go where we may. So, that's what we do here on the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. So Claire Potter is next. And I want to, again, as always, thank folk, number one, for listening, for sharing, for tweeting, for getting us out there. Please like us on iTunes. For folks who follow us, I should have made a post about this, but I'm bad at bureaucracy, I guess. So you can go to Kiwi 6, which is the free hosting service where I started this with. And in the future, I will use something else. I'm going to have to transition for better stats because the stats there are inaccurate. But it's good and it's free and it's reliable. So we sort of made it to it at this point. So folks who followed us there, you need to transition over to the direct stream for the podcast. So that way you can get it downloaded to you automatically, or just subscribe at iTunes. And that way you'll get all of season 3, but seasons 1 and 2 are on Kiwi 6. You just follow, go to podcastchaunceyDeVega.com on the website, click on it, and you'll get all those back episodes before we transitioned over to iTunes, improve the audio, what you're requesting, all that good stuff. So thanks to all the folks who supported us, who tweet, who download, who share, who Facebook, who send kind emails of suggestions and advice. So appreciative, so appreciated, and I want to thank you all for that. Coming up next, Dr. Claire Potter, talking about public memory, digital culture, archival research, porn, and wherever else we may go. Claire Potter, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with us on the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. How are you doing in New York, and what have you been up to?
Well, we're doing well in New York. There's a lot of activity, as I'm sure you've seen in the news, as I'm sure you've seen in the streets around you. The marches are very well organized and have been going on for a while. I think one of the things that's actually great about being in New York when there's this kind of political activity as we've had around Ferguson and the Eric Garner case is that New York is in many ways a very progressive place, except for Staten Island, and we should really talk about that. And it brings a lot of people into the streets. So you've got the unions, you've got the school teachers, you've got academics, and even people who aren't marching are pretty sympathetic to what's going on. I think, the Eric Garner case has hit everybody in a way that perhaps Michael Brown didn't, because everybody saw it on YouTube and it's happening right here. And I think there are an awful lot of people who have really been pushed in a direction that they wouldn't ordinarily be pushed by because of actually watching someone be murdered in front of them. It's very rare that you see that. I think we haven't really seen a graphic example of police violence that has gone so viral since the Rodney King case. So that when you have things like die-ins in Grand Central Station, a lot of the people who are going back to Long Island, a lot of white people who are going to segregated neighborhoods and segregated schools and so on, are actually kind of with the protesters, and you see people on their commutes sort of lying down and joining the protesters. It's been a really interesting moment in the city, and the protesters have been very firm in continuing their activities. Right.
And if you get locked into the mainstream media, and I guess your MSNBC, CNN, Fox, to those unfortunate folks who watch Fox Separate Conversation, you would think that the protests, because again, it's a drive-by media, right? If it bleeds, it leads, have stopped. So things are still going on today, even though the media coverage has basically turned to other events?
Oh, absolutely. There was a big protest on last Saturday, the Millions March, and you see small protests occurring here and there around Rockefeller Center, around all kinds of places where tourists have come in. Really, the protesters have been hitting the commuter hubs the most. There hasn't been anybody going onto the highways recently. I think the police have pretty much tried to stop that. But one of the things that's actually great, again, about being in New York is I think the mayor has been pretty firm about telling the police chief that these protests are going to take place. So the police have been opening bridges to the protesters and so on. And you see people sitting on the highway, sitting on the bridge, sitting in the roads, beeping their horns in support of the protesters. Yes, things are still going on. And I think there is going to be a great deal of long-term planning in New York City about how to address police violence.
I was thinking about, and one of the reasons I love talking to interesting and smart folks, as I'm fond of saying on the podcast, and you and I have been online friends for several years. We'll certainly talk about blogging and going down. And when you went to the American Sociological Association meeting?
Yes.
Right,
exactly.
Doing panels, and you also write for the Chronicle.
Yep.
I mean, so much to talk about. Since we're both students of popular culture and American culture, I was at the movies. I saw Chris Rock's movie, The Top Five.
Yeah.
And they had a trailer before that, and it's been, out now for a few months. And it's getting a lot of press for this new movie, Selma.
Yes.
About Dr. Martin Luther King. And I was thinking about, sort of the little-known history of the Black freedom struggle, and perhaps you can help remind me. There was a town, it wasn't Selma, it was right before Selma, where the mayor and the police got together, and they said basically, we're not going to fight back against the marchers, we're going to let them gather, we'll talk to them in private, and it'll blow over because they want a confrontation.
Right.
And it's one of those great historical what-ifs. If,
Right.
the Bull Connors of the world and others in the South were like, let them march.
Right.
We're not going to beat them up. So when you look at the protests in the age of neoliberalism and the carceral society and the surveillance society, do you think the mayor in New York and others are just playing it smart by saying, let the people march because nothing's really going to change? Or do you think they actually want to have some sort of marginal change and they're just letting, it's the safety valve release of the system at play?
Well, I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And, as you were talking, I was thinking about my collaborator, Renee Romano, who's just written an amazing book about the trials in the 1990s of people who murdered civil rights activists. And one of her arguments is exactly that all you have to do to turn one of these protests to the purpose of controlling people is to denature it, to take away the unpredictability, to make it convey a lesson about racial harmony instead of racial division, right? And so I think what you're saying makes a whole lot of sense. I think in New York there are a couple of things at stake. One is for the mayor as a white father of a black son. I think he's one of a number of white people I know with black children for whom they find themselves in a position with one kind of privilege and seeing their children vulnerable in another kind of way. And I think my black friends who have children do, for example, what is usually called the talk with black sons. White fathers often have to turn that over to mothers. They have to turn that over to other relatives. So I think the mayor is sort of standing in as both white person in charge and the guy who is really saying, I have something personal at stake here beyond even social justice, which I care about a great deal. I think the other thing about New York that's worth remembering is that New York is just a cesspool of police violence.
Yep.
And mostly people hear about the really famous case. There was a woman named Eleanor Bumpers, who was killed years ago. Police came into her apartment and she grabbed a knife and they shot her. There's Abner Louima. I mean, over and over and over again, we have these very high profile cases that draw national attention, but that actually kind of obscures the fact that every day people of color are subject to police violence in New York, in the public housing projects, in the streets. The schools are a place where children of color are disciplined constantly by police and various officials that are part of the public school system. So that on the one hand, having a really high profile event like the murder of Eric Garner and the failure to indict the police officer becomes something to raise these issues around. On the other hand, it really obscures the ways in which communities in New York are really bubbling over with rage about how they're treated. So I'm not altogether sure there's that much you can do to control it, to tell you the truth, except for the fact that New Yorkers are very, very well organized. And of course, this is the place where we had the Occupy Wall Street beginning, so that there are organizers out there who are not just working on the old civil rights model, but are working on new civil disobedience models that really kind of evade police strategies and are very adaptable, very, very changeable.
I mean, it's such a heck of a puzzle because on one hand, we want to believe in people power.
Yeah.
But the empirics tell us, well, we know we're in a corporate democracy that's run by interest groups,
right,
and a system, never mind the deep state, that's highly organized around very narrow networks of power. So
right.
On one hand, you want to tell the little kids and tell when you're the little kids in middle school, high school, I feel old, call them little kids, our college students, go out there and march, go out there and organize, right. Because maybe the real truth that this is an interest group society run by the plutocrats for all intents and purposes is just too damn depressing. So on one hand, you want to work within the public sphere, marching and organizing and so on. But the dilemma becomes, how do we actually organize inside?
Right.
Sort of the inside politics that actually get things done. Because maybe it's my jaded cynicism. I would think that the bankers and the plutocrats in New York and the financiers and the real estate barons would take the mayor aside and say, as long as the cops protect our property,
right,
we don't care. That's all we want.
Right.
But these optics are just unacceptable. It's hurting our pocketbooks.
Right.
And I hope those conversations are happening. I don't have great faith that they are, but I always believe in realpolitik, Right. And if you're not from the New York area, just for folks who are listening to us, I'm from Connecticut, as folks know, and have family in Staten Island, went to New York every other weekend. And I don't know if folks who aren't from the area get the racial geography involved. Because I remember going to see relatives and going over the bridge to Queens, going to Elmont, going to Staten Island where my aunt lives. And as a person of color, as a black family, working class family in a semi-new car, we just got the car, we were afraid of the cops. We're like, we don't want these Long Island cops stopping us because we have heard too many things about how horribly they treat people.
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely right. And I would have to say, I mean, in relation to what you're saying, it's no accident that the indictment or that the grand jury that failed to indict the officer was in Staten Island. I mean, I actually remember at the moment the news was coming out, I was in my office with a couple of students, one of whom lives on Staten Island. And she said, I really need to leave a little early to get home because the grand jury's just come in and things are going to get really bad really fast. And I said, sure. And we were all horrified, and she just shook her head and said, everybody on Staten Island knew it was going to come down this way because there isn't anybody on Staten Island that doesn't know a police officer. Staten Island is a very sort of particular place in the five boroughs. First of all, they're always trying to secede. Every 10 or 15 years, Staten Island tries to leave New York City. But the other thing is, it is a place that has been very segregated over time, very white. Lots of police and firefighters live there. In a way, the police kind of run the place. My comparison would be to Simi Valley after the Rodney King beating. Simi Valley was not a place you were going to get an indictment because everybody's a police officer and nobody on that grand jury wants to be subject to police violence themselves or intimidation and so on. But what's actually kind of astonishing, I recently did jury duty in Brooklyn about a year ago. And, there's a time when they sort of get rid of everybody that for a variety of reasons. When we finally got into the jury room, in a jury pool of 50 people, 30 of them were either former police officers or were related to police officers in some way. So it gives you a sense of how unbelievably influential a police department in a major American city is. I mean, there are really so many of them, and the expansion of the police force over the past 20 or 25 years means that actually nearly everybody knows one. Nearly everybody is related to one or is a police officer.
And I was thinking when you mentioned, Rodney King and then this idea, Judith Butler famously talked about the white paranoiac gaze. Yeah. And how with the Rodney King, right, folks looked at that video and somehow miraculously, our white brothers and sisters and some black conservatives and others imagine that Rodney King was actually responsible for his own vicious beating. That
Right.
somehow this man was a threat to the cops and he was provoking them. And I go back and forth with the Eric Garner case because on one hand, I'm like, okay, black and brown folks and white civil rights activists and others have been talking about these issues for centuries. This is not a surprise. But somehow now we got to figure out, well, have we had quote unquote racial progress enough in 20 or 30 years, open question there, that reasonable white folks will look at Rodney King in this moment and be like, oh my God, how did that happen? And then look at Eric Garner and say, oh my God, we must act. So maybe it's a generational shift. But then you have the Washington Post, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, I don't know if you saw the story, they collapsed together some public opinion polls. Mm-hmm. And they actually found that since Ferguson to Gardner to the present, that white support for the police has actually increased. And when they asked white and African-American respondents, do you think the police treat black people fairly? More white respondents, after seeing all of this, the violence, the brutality, the murder of Eric Garner, actually think that the cops are fair to African-Americans. So at one point, I'm like, we've made some progress here, but white privilege and the white racial paranoia gaze still distorts a good number of people's cognitive processes. I mean, it's stunning to me.
Well, I think there are a couple things going on. And because you and I spend so much time on social media, I think they're kind of amplified for me. One is that segregation is both very real and invisible to most white people. So, if you sort of, move around the world. I mean, I'm astonished as a white person, not astonished, but it's just remarkable to me how many white people actually don't have a friend who is a person of color. And I've often said, if you actually know how many friends you have who are people of color, you actually don't have enough friends. Yep. And so the whole Black Lives Matter campaign has been so important because I don't think black people are real to a lot of white people. I think they listen to music, they go to the movies, celebrities are real to them, which of course is ironic and peculiar since celebrities aren't real people at all.
People, exactly.
But black people, just ordinary black people, are not real to them. That is one thing that's going on. I think there's another thing that's going on. I think this is probably much more true among white people than it is among people of color, is that we seem to live in a society now where more or less a lot of people seem to think that when misfortunes happen to people, they must have done something wrong. And
we call that's good. We good social scientists call that the just world fallacy.
Right. Exactly. So if you can figure out, and you and I see this on social media all the time, I will have commenters come on and say, well, I can't possibly read another blog post of yours because there's a typo in paragraph 3. So that if anybody does anything wrong, that completely invalidates them as an object of empathy or sympathy or someone who has constitutional rights or, anything like that. So I think the first question a lot of white people ask when somebody is harmed by the police is, well, what did they do? What did they do wrong? And yet the part that they never get to is if, in fact, it is revealed. Like I remember years ago, there was a young man who was shot up in the Bronx when he was removing his wallet from his back pocket to show his ID. And even when the grand jury came in and said, yes, that's what happened, and it was wrong, and so on and so forth, that doesn't seem to change people's minds about what they want to see, what they want to believe, and so on. So I think the whole question of Eric Garner, that he was out selling loose cigarettes. Okay, so there are two kinds of responses to that. One is to say, well, of course that's against the law. What was he doing that? It's really too bad he was killed, but he never should have been doing that in the first place. And then there's the other thing that you might say, which would take you to an entirely different analysis and a different conclusion about even why a police officer would have approached him in the first place, which is, why doesn't this man have access to a job that would allow him to not do this? I mean, he had a family, and he was trying to support his family selling cigarettes on the street. And that, in some ways, I mean, his death is the greatest obscenity, but there's another obscenity there, which is, why is a working man, someone who's trying to make a living, doing it in this way? how have we failed as a society that there are people selling cigarettes on the street?
And that gets us to, the failure of systems level thinking in this country.
Of course.
That's rooted in American individualism, a failed school system, the just world fallacy that is, extremely profound, and the culture of cruelty, especially among right-wing conservatives.
Right.
I mean, if you sort of think about their ideologies and how they think about quote-unquote useless eaters and the racialization of the poverty discourse. But I was thinking about your example about friendship.
Yep.
And, you've been online for some time, and both of us blogging and social media and other types of digital media, that when I talk to students, I'm really struck by their changing definition of friendship. Because when I talk about, how highly segregated social networks are, I think the last data I saw was 91% of white folks don't know someone who's not white. And I share this information with them, and I ask them, do you have any friends who aren't white? And they all raise their hands. Then the follow-up question is, people in the real world who you talk to in, meet space and that have been over your house.
Right.
Most of their hands go down. And the objection is, well, people online are our friends. I was like, well, in what way? In what capacity?
Right.
And my definition of friendship is, what I try to use, and some students love it and some hate it. Like, I go back to the General Social Survey, which comes out every so many years, and they had a great question. This was like in the late 90s, early 2000s, about basically race and social networks. And the way they crystallized it, I mean, whoever wrote up the survey is just a genius, was basically asking the respondent, have you had someone of a different race over your house to eat? And my corollary to that, or auxiliary / asterisk, is I asked the students, how many people have you let use the bathroom in your house? Really use the bathroom. I say to them, not number one, number two.
Right.
And I said, a friend is someone you'll let stink up your bathroom, or alternatively will help you move, and you don't have to pay them. And the hands go down immediately.
Yep. Well, I think it's interesting what you're saying about the redefinition of friendship, and that your students consider people of color that they know online to be friends. One of the things that I think is really remarkable, although perhaps not so remarkable, about social media is how unbelievably racially segregated it is. Because there is no casual contact on social media, or at least certainly things like Facebook, that, the chances of meeting someone who is outside the institutions that you're already in are very, very small. So that, for example, academics, if your institution is racially segregated, which many of them are, most of them are, and your coworkers or your fellow students are the people who are in your network, you're going to have a segregated network. And I think what you're saying about friendship within that narrows it even further. What I also find remarkable about social media is that people do a kind of, by retweeting things, by reposting things, by grabbing memes, posting them on Facebook and blogs and Tumblr and things like that, they often think that they are removing various kinds of cultural artifacts from a racial context. And so they do horrible things online, and then you ask them about them, and they don't know what you're talking about. So that somebody posted something on my Facebook the other day about a political thing that may be happening at the American Historical Association about Israel-Palestine, and I said, there doesn't seem anything wrong with this to me. It's a resolution objecting to the bombing of educational institutions and archives in Gaza during the summer war. And the person responded to me, well, this is just the camel's nose under the tent. And I sent a private message, and I said, look, you can't use that kind of language when we're talking about Palestinian people. And he said, what? And I thought, well, either, there is a fantasy that everybody on this Facebook is white, or because it is happening online, there's no recognition that this is a kind of racially loaded language. So I think social media is very, very odd in terms of what people think they're doing, what they think their real relationships are, and who they're with.
In thinking about digital media, I always try to be critically self-reflective whenever possible. I fail more often than not. But when you think about social media and digital democracy and digital culture, do you see it as an extension of what we would call digital democracy, and that it's, it is purposive political behavior that has substance and meaning? Or do you think the vast majority of it is just ephemeral? I mean, folks tweeting and talking online, but not actually translating that into public action? Because that's one of my concerns. Right. When I think about my own work, I'm like, people say I'm a journalist. I'm like, no, I'm a cultural critic. I'm an essayist. Right. I'm not a journalist. I hold journalists in very high regards. But then I start asking myself, are we actually doing anything
Right.
of substance? Because for me, writing online, is a way of working out thoughts in public that we may actually write about in another capacity.
Right.
And learning from folks. And it's another type of teaching. And I believe in public pedagogy, deeply
Right.
believe in it. But do you think the vast majority of folks who are, playing online with, Twitter hashtags, Black Lives Matter, or talking about police brutality, or talking about the kidnapping of those young women in sub-Saharan Africa, that it's all just a distraction? Maybe I sound too much like, a student of mass culture in Adorno, and it's not substantive, and it's just, you're just tweeting your thumbs together, you're not really doing anything? Or do you think there's an either or? I mean, how do you work through that for yourself?
First of all, like you, I think about blogging as a kind of public pedagogy, and my other social media activity really mostly exists to support my blogging. So I use Twitter and Facebook to get my posts around. I sometimes put up things that I think people ought to be reading. I put up things that my friends have written and so on. I don't engage in a lot of politics on Facebook for a couple of reasons. One is, and I think this is sort of what you're getting at, it seems like a kind of slacktivism for me, that you are performing for your friends, for your social circle, what a political person you are. I hate to sort of pin this on one group, but I think the white left is particularly culpable in this regard, that there is this sort of desire to frame your outrage for your friends so that they will know you're really a good person and you're really having the right thoughts. But when it comes down to it, you're not involved in organizing, and I would like to say everybody can't be involved in organizing.
That's right.
If you are a college professor, for example, I don't think you have to say, well, my real political work is in the classroom. I think you could just say, I'm a college professor, and it takes a lot of time. And I try to write good scholarship, and I try to write good blog posts, and I do have certain kinds of political commitments. But you don't actually have to pretend to be a firebrand for people to like you or think you're good. And I think the corollary of that is that there is an awful lot of shouting so that you won't become suspicious to your friends. And people won't think that you're really lacking in radicalism or lacking in the right opinions. I think this is a problem in the sense that it's not just that people are talking the talk and not walking the walk, but that often people are tweeting and Facebooking things that actually aren't true, or that, really they need to be a little bit more thoughtful about before they're putting out there. I don't know whether you read my recent blog post about a poor guy at a Northeastern university who had been tweeting late last summer and early September and claiming that his university had institutionalized him because his tweets were too radical. The Daily Beast picked it up, and there was a big article going around on Facebook among academics saying, this is outrageous, this is just like what happened to Stephen Saleta, what kind of place do we live in if our universities can put us in mental institutions for tweeting, blah, blah, blah. So I went and read the article, and there wasn't a shred of evidence that this had actually happened. And I began to poke around, and in fact, I'm quite sure this didn't happen. And it may be possible that the man who was sending these tweets doesn't know that it didn't happen. I mean, I don't know. I don't know him, and I don't really know more about the story than that. I don't think we have to hold everything we write and everything we tweet and everything we Facebook to a scholarly standard, but I think we should bring some of that scrutiny and some of that gravitas if we actually think about ourselves as public people who ought to be listened to.
How is, working online and your public persona? We talked about this when you kindly had me guest lecture via Skype or Skype/phone for your class. We'll talk about the class you're teaching on digital media.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you separate the personas? Is Claire Potter, the public intellectual blogger for the Chronicle and person on Twitter, the same person as Claire Potter, the historian and student of American culture?
Absolutely not. And I think of those two people as very separate, in part because online and on blog, I get to be flip. I get to curse. I get to, there are all kinds of ways in which blogging as a rhetorical style is profoundly different from scholarship or even the kind of public intellectual work that one might do in the New York Times or in Jacobin. And I mean, I wrote an article for Jacobin about a year and a half ago, and It's very different from my scholarship, but it isn't anything like my blog voice. And I think the tenured radical persona is really there to provoke people. It's not surprising that in the end it does provoke people, sometimes in quite dramatic ways. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately because I don't really like it to have blog posts then get me mired down in conflict with people, either in the comments section or on Twitter. And I've been trying to think about what I want to do about that, whether I want to be less provocative or whether I want to be just as provocative and simply not respond to people. I mean, after all, David Brooks doesn't respond to people. But no, they are very different persona. I would say, however, that what the tenured radical allows me to do is create broader comment on other kinds of cultural artifacts and scholarly artifacts, so that to the extent that I can talk about how, say, that item in the Daily Beast, what's wrong with it from my perspective, and why, in fact, it's doing a kind of cultural damage by putting things out in the world that aren't true for people. I can do that as the tenured radical, and it matters. If I were to do that as a scholar, it would actually be somewhat trivial.
And since you have the protection of tenure, how has that sort of been navigated? Not so much tenure per se, I'll rephrase that. So you have the protection of tenure, so you have a certain latitude and freedom of action. But in terms of writing for the Chronicle for an primarily academic audience, your peers, then going to conferences and then also teaching, is there a generational difference in how your peers respond to you? I mean, are there other folks who are more older who would say, okay, you know what, this is public pedagogy stuff is a waste? So, I mean, is there a generational difference in response? And for younger scholars, when you go to conferences and your students as well, grad students and undergrad, do they see you as some sort of rock star? And like, oh my God, there's Tenured Radical and she's so cool?
Actually, they do. And, I began to realize this about a year and a half into the blogging experience. When I was on a search committee, we were hiring someone. This is when I was still at Wesleyan. And I was the person that was in charge of walking people in and out of the room. And I was walking someone out of the room and someone sort of turns around, this job candidate who just finished an interview, and whispers under her breath, "Your blog is amazing." And I was like, wow. But yeah, people do actually love to meet me and are, and there are also actually some people out there who love to hate me too. But there is a lot of publicity involved for it. I would say at my old shop at Wesleyan, there were a lot of people who really didn't like it. And I actually think elite institutions have a much greater skepticism about this kind of thing than less elite institutions. That there's a kind of sense that, you've made it, you have the status, you have a certain kind of profile. Why would you risk that by doing this other thing? On the other hand, the job that I have now, one of the reasons they wanted to hire me was because of the blogging. And because the particular school that I was hired in at the new school or the division has as its mandate what they call public engagement. So they actually wanted scholars, and there are a lot of scholars that worked in my division before I got there, who are very involved in community partnerships, are very involved in public writing. And so we're really encouraged to get out there, to do television, to speak, and so on and so forth. And I think, part of my analysis is that places like Wesleyan, or Harvard or, any elite college or university, they talk a lot about the importance of the humanities, but actually the humanities are safe there. Right? You don't have the entire English department being let go and every course being taught by contingent faculty. Whereas at the place I work, the new school, it's always been heavily driven, by adjunct hiring. We're tuition driven and so on. And so when you're thinking about the survival of the humanities, it's really a pocketbook issue. If you are not making the humanities relevant, people aren't going to enroll in your university. If I can't say to my students who are taking out loans many of whom are sacrificing time that they could otherwise be spending at work or with their families to finish a BA. If I can't say to them, this is how you use the humanities in the world, this is how you put them in action, and if I can't embody that, then, really, I have nothing to give them. They need to know those things. So I do think it's very situational. And I do think that colleges and universities and their faculty are going to have to figure out where they stand on this. If we don't offer a humanities vision that is engaging for the public, actually, I think we're going to die.
I mean, and it gets us, the New York Times had that editorial, I think it was last year, basically talking about how, the university is dead and we're still teaching using models from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and the new thing has to be MOOCs and digital media and getting rid of majors and specialization. And I read that and I was like, interesting argument. But again, in my own classrooms, I tell the students I have a no technology policy. All you need is a pen and a piece of paper, right? I don't need the distractions. We don't need the trouble. And this worked for thousands of years and it will work 1,000 years from now. And that having been said, I mean, the university and the quote unquote life of the mind, what has ever happened to that, exists within the broader political economy of this country. So everything you see with neoliberalism, surveillance, creating economic insecurity, in this case, the destruction of tenure, only hiring adjuncts, the idea that you have to please the student, right? The idea of sort of the customer service model because of efficiency, getting rid of whole departments. Because it's the purpose of the liberal arts and the university, is it to make thinkers who are better citizens, or in the age of cruelty and neoliberalism, is it to make drones who have useful skills, who will be insecure about their futures and in debt and not rock the boat? And when you see how these same processes happen, that's why, I always laugh when they say that academics have it so good. I'm like, well, maybe 1% of them do. But the vast majority in this country and elsewhere do not. And I just shake my head at the utter disconnect between the general public and how very many of them don't understand that the same things that are going on in the university are the same things that are going on at the McDonald's or at Walmart. And never mind, the university is one of the last places that's a redoubt against, sort of extreme right-wing conservatism, which is why the Koch brothers are buying up departments, which is why they hate academia. They're like, no, we need to get after knowledge production.
No, I think all of those things are true. And I think the public doesn't understand what we do. And if that's the case, we have to teach them better. I mean, it's kind of like, if you think about the public as your classroom, if you were teaching a class and everybody in the class were failing, you would have to, at some level, accept responsibility for that. There's something that you are doing as a teacher that's not working with this group of students, and you need to go back and fix that. And I think one of the things that's very important about blogging, that's very important about all of the ways that have opened up to people like you and to me to be public intellectuals, is it does put us in a teaching position to a much larger public, and to persuade people that actually what they think they know is not what they need to know. And so to the extent that the story out there about higher education is that tuition is going up, and students are getting less and less and less and less, and they're less prepared than they ever have been. I mean, none of these things are true in the simple way that the people who sort of put it out there want them to be true. So I think, our responsibility is to say over and over again, if tuitions are going up, it's because support for education is going down. If, in fact, endowments are going up, I did a story recently on the top 13 endowments. Harvard has an endowment of something like $35 billion right now. NYU has an endowment of $16 billion. Well, somebody needs to ask the question, why are endowments like that justified in the face of tuitions that are that high? That's a different question than saying, why, in fact, as an out-of-state student at the University of California, Berkeley, will you pay the same tuition with less access to financial aid than you will pay at, Harvard? Okay. I mean, the economics of universities are very, very complex now. And the answers to the questions that students and their parents and the general public want are being obscured. And I think it's our job to sort of dig around and to actually demonstrate the complexity of these issues, even if we can't come up with policies, even if we can't answer all the questions about them, but to keep insisting on what's true.
And that makes, and getting into sort of the nuts and bolts details, when you actually look at who's making the money at universities, it's administrators, right? So you have the money going up to the very top, to the deans, to the coaches of these athletic programs. And then you have all this other money being spent to please the customer and giving students these huge, ridiculous gyms and Olympic-sized swimming pools because you're like, okay, we need to go out here and we need to, number one, spend all the money on sports because there's a direct relationship, apparently, between your team's placement in the NCAA divisions and the number of casual students who will make a decision based on an athletic team. I never heard of this. I remember when I was going to college, I didn't care about sports. And the idea that someone would say, I'm going to go to college A over college B, and I don't even play sports because of the visibility of their sports team is ludicrous in a lot of ways. But again, that tells us a lot about the general public, right? And sort of the decision-making processes of young people and how we failed, I think, as teachers in high school. And also, again, the bureaucracy at work that directs students to certain types of programs and not to others. But earlier you mentioned, the digital humanities. What happened with the course you were teaching? Because one of my most pleasant experiences of the last year was actually talking to your classroom. So how do you actually reach out and teach folks about blogging and digital media? And what was the response of the students like to our conversation and just the course more generally?
Well, the students absolutely loved our conversation, and their response to the course, they were very engaged with it. And I would have to say a couple of things about teaching blogging. One is I actually think it's very important in this day and age when most students will not, when they leave college, probably go into the career that they're going to have for the rest of their lives. And in order for any of them who have half a chance of doing what they dream of doing, they will probably have to do internships. They'll probably have to go into entry-level positions. And one of the things increasingly that they will be asked to do is maintain blogs. All organizations have blogs. Blogging is a kind of public relations. I mean, in the last 10 years, it has changed so dramatically from the kind of, personal space where you do your writing or, the kind of thing you and I do. Blogs are part of large public relations apparatuses nowadays. So one of the things I decided, particularly for my students, many of whom are at Parsons or at Manus, where they're involved with music and art primarily, that I really needed to teach them not just writing, but the kind of writing they would be asked to do as they were trying to pursue a career. So that was very important. What they ended up liking about it, as much as anything else, is they started forgetting that it was writing. And they began to sort of relax and find their own voices. It's a very different kind of writing than they're asked to do in most of their courses. It's not formal. It's actually published. People read it and so on. So that it gave them a little taste of not just what it means to write for public, but what it might be like to be read. So that when they published their posts, for example, the whole class read it, and by about the second or third week, they started realizing that people were following their blogs, people that weren't at the new school at all. And so that's the kind of experience you rarely get in a class. I think one of the things they loved about our conversation, and I also brought Ann Little in at another point in the semester, is that they got to talk to people who are writers about writing. Again, I think that's something students, at least students that aren't in an MFA program or something, they rarely get to do that. And they rarely get to actually read someone and say, well, why do you do it that way? Or how did you decide to do X, Y, or Z? And I think it gave them a real taste of what it means to be engaged with professionals. I think school can often give you a great taste of what it's like to be engaged with academics, but not necessarily with professionals and talking to and making relationships with professionals who aren't your teachers.
Here's a basic question. As I said, again, thinking about, we talked about this idea the online persona is a persona and thinking about actors and actresses, how those are not real people. But how do you sort of define for yourself what it means to be a professional blogger? Is there such a thing? Is it, okay, if you've gotten paid one check over $50, you're a professional? Is it craft? Is it practice? Is it presentation? I mean, I'm sure that must have come up in the conversation with the students because, they deify these folks they read and they respect their work and find it interesting. But then it gets into, again, my favorite phrase, nuts and bolts about how do you do this consistently on a day-to-day basis, or how do you sort of, work on your craft? How do you get exposure? But for yourself, like, how would you explain that to the students about what it means to be a professional online personality?
Just to backtrack a little bit, I think one of the things that you said to them that was really great was actually talking about how your audience waxes and wanes over the course of the week and how you actually plan posts around that. And I had actually forgotten to say anything to them about it, but sort of realizing actually it's not just writing, it's a practice that goes beyond writing. It's a strategy. It's a way of sort of figuring out how and when people are paying attention. In terms of explaining to them about myself, one of the things I actually talked about a lot were the unpleasant things that could happen online, that people actually get to come out of nowhere and say things to you that nobody would ever say to your face. And I actually had a lot to say to them about that, because if I actually had my blogging career to do over again, I might spend less time using the blog as a platform for controversy. It's one thing to be controversial myself. I actually don't mind that. And I told them I didn't mind that. And that it's actually a responsibility anybody who writes and publishes has to assume. But I think if I had it to do over again, I would probably have less sort of prolonged back and forths that were very sort of public arguments. I mean, the thing I got into around the American Studies Association a year ago, for example, which the president of the ASA took very personally. I mean, I kind of look back on that and say, could I have just stayed out of that?
And in just the bullet points, so what was the controversy about? And I mean, did he literally or she literally reach out to you and say, you've personally hurt me?
Oh, no, it was actually worse than that. The controversy was about the boycott, divest, sanction resolution at the American Studies Association, and the resolution to boycott Israel, which I have many mixed feelings about. I think is a very, very complex issue. But at the time, I was very opposed to it because I really felt it was a question of academic freedom, and that I didn't think a professional organization should in fact stand for limiting academic freedom. The people who were supporting the resolution, which included the president of the American Studies Association, feel very differently about it, and they are very vocal about it, and they're very passionate about it, and they see opposition to, or they saw opposition to what they wanted as ethically wrong. And the president is a person who actually, I've known her for years. She does take things very personally, for whatever reason, I don't really know. But then she kind of went on the attack against me personally, that, this was just an opportunity for me to attack her and so on, which actually I had not intended. But I think I probably should have foreseen that it would play out that way. And I did not take the time to think about it. Now, would I have made the decision to not take a stand on that? I don't really know, but I wish, looking back on it, that I had sort of affirmatively made the decision to do it, even though I knew it was going to go down in an ugly way. So I have talked to the students about that sometimes an opportunity to speak your mind about something and to get your opinion out there on an issue of great public importance is something that can involve you in controversy, and you need to think through, 2 or 3 steps down the line, how you're going to feel about it as it plays out before you make the decision to
Thinking
do it.
about, for folks on the left, and I think it operates in a parallel way for folks on the right, perhaps with just different dimensions, thinking about sort of the performance of politics and the performance of outrage.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I told your students this. One of the things I made a decision early on about when I was getting, some, initial popularity around, the Herman Cain stuff and Fox News and other people trying to get me to come out of the closet, so to speak. And I remember I got an email from some folks saying, well, why don't you have an opinion about this issue or that issue? And I said, I don't need to have an opinion about everything. And you don't need to write about every issue. And sometimes, like you said, it's about managing your outrage and managing your commentary, because sometimes you got to make a choice. Do I really want to deal with this issue in this venue and then have to deal with the consequences later on?
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. And you have to decide which issues are really worth it to you. Like, I've written a lot about campus rape, and I do not regret a single post I have written about rape on campus, even though some of them have gotten me some actually really terrible hate mail. I've gotten phone calls from people saying that they were going to come to my house and rape me. I mean, there are a lot of really, you probably have gotten some of this too. I mean, there's just a lot of really horrible, vicious people out there with violent imaginations, and it's not that hard to find somebody. It's not hard to find me, but because
you're public and you're out
face
there.
And my email address, it's right out there. But people can find your home address. I mean, I have gotten telephone calls saying, I know where you live and I'm coming there and I'm going to kill your dog and I'm going to, but even though those things have happened, I don't regret a single thing that I have written about rape. I do sometimes regret posts that people have taken personally that I have not really anticipated that they would take personally. But also I think, and I talk to the students about this a little bit too. The tricky thing about blogging, as you know, is that you can get a comment from someone that says, this is absolutely wrong and you're a horrible person and you never should have used this word and you shouldn't do that. And it's possible to kind of lose your confidence, and you can't always be responding to the negative. You can't always be second guessing yourself. And I think, that has certainly come up with the most recent post I did about the man who seems to believe that he was incarcerated in a mental institution at the behest of MIT. The title I chose for it was, I used the guy's name and then the loony bin trip. Which, of course, to me was a clear allusion to Kate Millett's anti-institutionalization and anti-forced medication memoir about her life as a person with bipolar disease. And people were just outraged. You are not allowed to use the word loony. You are not. Unless you are mentally ill yourself, you are not allowed to use it. And at first I was sort of thinking, God, maybe that was really a terrible mistake. And then I thought, no, if they don't know Kate Millett, they're really not very educated people, So I think, it's difficult as a blogger sometimes to keep your sense of who you are as you're being attacked by people. But it's really important to have a kind of thought process that you engage in to say, okay, was that the right thing to do? Was that not the right thing to do? Would I do it again? Would I not do it again? How do I plan my blog going forward to both honor the things I need to talk about and minimize the kind of destructive conflict that can keep you up late at night monitoring your comments section?
I mean, do you even read the comments? Because some of the best advice I've gotten is don't even look at the comments.
Yeah. I had this conversation with a elderly woman who was the first woman who was a political reporter for the St. Petersburg Times. And she spent most of her life in Gainesville. And I said, I'm trying to decide whether to read my comments or not. And she said, and I guess she's like 82 now. She said, oh, I always read my comments. And I said, why? And she said, because actually that's how sometimes people get me information anonymously that otherwise I'll never get from them. And so, and that absolutely has been true on my blog. I mean, sometimes if I pursue a certain kind of thread, the person will eventually write to me and so on. But, I also think on a certain level, if you're not going to read the comments as a blogger, and I think it's different as a journalist or someone who publishes on an online magazine, if you're not going to read the comments as a blogger, at least I feel like I might lose my sense of what the audience cares about and what they need to know and maybe what I need to know from them. Because, I mean, we are really just alone in our rooms doing this. There isn't a whole lot of social context. We don't have editors. So the comment section for me is almost the only way of keeping my finger on the pulse of what's out there.
Yeah, and that's why, I made the decision about 2 years ago to more heavily moderate the comment section, because it is, a private conversation. It's a salon. And as I say in the disclaimer of the website, I'm like, you wouldn't go to somebody's house and pee on the floor and they get mad at them for having a dirty house. So there's certain noxious personalities that I just don't want around. And if you're not going to abide by basic rules of civility and self-respect, I quite frankly don't want you here. But switching gears a little bit, maybe it's my own juvenile prurient interests about sex and sexuality and pornography. What's your new project about? Because, I follow your work pretty closely. And anytime I get a chance to talk about porn and Ronald Reagan, even for a few minutes, I have to take it.
Yeah, well, my new project, actually, I've got a draft of it that is now being revised. It's called Beyond Pornography: How Feminism Survived the Age of Reagan, and it puts the so-called feminist sex wars at the center, feminist anti-pornography campaigns, and then the feminists who organized to oppose those campaigns. And the central argument is that feminism actually survived in the form that it did because of anti-pornography campaigns, because in fact anti-pornography campaigns were something that people organized around and organized against, and that they took feminism from a kind of community-oriented grassroots activism to the level of the state. And anti-pornography activists began to make arguments about gender equality in a language of statism by the 1980s, which really gives us the feminist political landscape we have today. It's a really fun project, in part because it's recent political history. There are tons and tons of sources, but it allows me to open up well-known histories and well-known stories about feminism and look at them in very different ways. And of course, the personalities are very vivid. I mean, it's a dream to be able to organize a book around the likes of Susan Brown-Miller and Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon and Gloria Steinem.
And in writing the book, how did you deal with the challenge of the fact that many of these subjects are still alive? I mean, how did that complicate the work?
Yeah, it complicates the work. It continues to complicate the work in a couple of ways. One is a lot of the archives I've worked in are literary figures, people like Kate Millett and Robin Morgan and Susan Brown-Miller. They're all still alive, and most of them have retained the literary rights to their archives, which is kind of a new feature of the archival landscape. I think literary scholars deal with it a lot more than historians do. But it's difficult because in order to get into these archives, you actually have to sign something that says you understand that you don't have the right to quote without permission. So the final stage of the book is going to be submitting the manuscript to some pretty harsh critics, and they get to decide whether I get to use their quotes in the ways I want to use them. The flip side of that is I've actually acquired some interesting allies. Susan Brown-Miller is one of the first people I interviewed for the book, and she's been extraordinarily helpful, both in steering me to other people, helping me find things in archives. Sometimes I'll be in an archive and find something I can't make any sense of, and I'll write her an email saying, do you remember so-and-so? And, all of these women have very, very vivid memories of the past. Sometimes it's not always accurate, but they are vivid. I have found that, I really don't have much of a view of pornography at all. I mean, what's really interesting is what they want to know about you is, are you pro or are you anti? Mm-hmm. And the truth is, I'm neither. I couldn't care less about pornography. I really couldn't. So once I've sort of made that clear, not that I'm not neutral in any way. I mean, I think we historians know that neutrality is neither desirable nor possible in historical writing. But I am actually interested in what happened, and I'm interested in the ideas that were at stake and why the struggle against pornography unfolded in the way it did and what it produced. And I think that story is really a story that has only been told in a very sketchy way. So I think they're interested in having their story told. I think that's really the short version of it. They care very deeply about having the story told and having it told in a way that's accurate. So what I try to do is meet their standards for accuracy. I can't necessarily make the arguments that they want me to make, but I can make their arguments in an accurate way.
I mean, that's a really important nuance there about thinking about how you respect folks' wishes. Because, I mean, it's a huge puzzle because you're talking about the truth.
Yeah.
People massage their own image and distort the truth. And are we obligated to their personal truth, or are we obligated to some higher empirical truth about the consequences of their work? How do we locate it within certain regimes of power, and sort of reproducing knowledge? But here's just a random question, not a random one. Here's a, mischievous question, a human question.
Yeah.
Have you ever found anything in an archive where you're just like, oh my goodness, I didn't need to know this about this person? Or I don't know if anyone has seen this, because I have a very good friend who does archival cataloging and research, and he talks about he gets these collections and processes them. And he said some of the, he was talking about photos that have been included, and he said some of the photos of famous people that are in some of these other folks' collections, he's like, you have no idea what's going on in some folks' personal lives. I mean, have you had a moment like that where you were looking through there and you're just like, oh boy, I don't know if I want to talk about this, or you're just so titillated, you're like, even if they say no, I'm going to write about this somehow.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a ton of that stuff. And of course, archival practices have changed. And, now, it used to be archives received things and they would reorganize them in ways that made sense to them. And now, of course, they don't. They try to maintain as much of the original order as possible, which can actually sort of make archives a little more difficult to use, but it means there's a lot more of that random stuff in there. In particular, when you're dealing with early radical feminism, of course, radical feminism was this really erotic location. And, so they would have conferences, they would get together and so on. And so there's all kinds of steamy material between very famous figures. I probably the funniest thing I ever found, it's sort of like sad funny, was in a collection of someone who I probably should not name, who had been to one of these conferences, gave a big keynote, and this person was famous for having, little conference flings with women and then returning to her husband. And so then whoever she'd had a fling with sent a letter afterwards, sort of, describing the whole weekend in excruciating detail. And it was clear this person felt that this was a thing and it was going to continue. And the letter ended by saying, I'm eager to see you again, and I know you're very busy, so it will be a while before you can come back. So I have purchased a plant, and I have given it your name, and I'm going to care for the plant just as I would care for you. And I was like, oh my God. And what's fascinating, actually, is that this famous feminist left it in there. Now, it's actually possible she had no idea, that it's there. Some of these archives are just voluminous. Kate Millett's archive, for example, Kate Millett was just a pack rat. And so she's got stuff from all over the women's movement, even things she wasn't involved in. So it's unlikely to me that most of them actually knew what was in these boxes they were giving away. And giving away is actually a euphemism. They sold them. So a lot of these collections have been purchased. It's also true that there's some key collections where you really need to establish a relationship with literary executors in order to use them properly. And I think one of the great benefits about taking care with the people I've worked with and working hard to write things in ways that I wouldn't exactly say have a standard, but in ways that seem fair. Let's say I try to be fair. One of the great benefits is that they will let you in to things that you would not otherwise get to see. So there have been several collections that I've been allowed to see restricted material that I can't quote, but even if you can't quote it, it answers questions for you.
You can triangulate around it, I would think, right? Or you can allude to it and it sort of enriches the narrative you already have.
Absolutely. And you can know if, something that you've actually speculated about is wrong. Or whether it's right. And so it gives you confidence in some of the other material that you've got. So being able to get those kind of permissions from people is very, very helpful. It's also true with a lot of these collections that survivors, and friends have materials that aren't in them. And so once you kind of get into it and you make contact with these people, as it turns out, actually, there's a whole album of photographs that the archive didn't want that is much more appealing than the photographs that you've got. So doing this kind of research is in many ways about the relationships. As much as it's about the research.
Yeah, and I have this mischievous smirk on my face. I'm thinking about Seinfeld, and I think the episode was the Jonathan Cleaver letters, where they go and one of the characters finds out that her father is a closeted gay man, and they're at the cabin, and the only thing that survives the fire are his love letters between his secret lover, who was a friend of the family, and I remember the moment where they talk about it, and everybody's sort of awkwardness, and it makes me think about, my goodness, if something were to happen to me, I told a friend, I'm like, here's where all this stuff I don't want my mother to find is.
That's
so
right.
go through the apartment and throw all this stuff out, because I need to maintain this veneer of respectability. I'll be too embarrassed otherwise. As we close the conversation, I want to come full circle very quickly as where we started talking about New York City. So you're a scholar of American public culture and popular culture and related issues. Here's a question for you. You're sitting in New York, and I've wondered about this. How did New York, in particular Manhattan, get so boring? Because, the Disneyfication of Manhattan is just so fascinating to me. I remember it had to be like the early 90s, late 90s. I was going to Manhattan, to Midtown, to see a woman I was dating. She lived in Queens. And my father and my mother always like, be careful, they'll rob you and kill you. And I was like, Mom and Dad, it's like Disney World now. And my father, was a musician. I mentioned it many times on the podcast. And he had this horrific story about getting off to do he had to play in some club in Midtown. And he got off at Grand Central, was going to get a cab, and then he said he'll take a shortcut through Central Park. And this kind old lady stopped him and said, "There are killers in there. They'll kill you. Don't walk through there." And maybe during like sort of the Pelham 1, 2, 3, Fort Apache, Charles Bronson era of New York, that was the case. But I remember the Midtown of my high school and middle school years was full of pornography, video game arcades, prostitutes, all sorts of really cool stuff. And it's gone. I mean, how did that happen?
Well, of course, a big part of the pornography cleanup, I mean, this is sort of actually the end of the book I'm writing, was the Giuliani administration. That, a big argument was made that you had to get rid of the pornography, A, to get rid of organized crime, and B, in order to create taxable property. Right? Because people didn't want to buy luxury homes, or any homes at all, in areas that they saw as, full of people who were miscreants of various kinds. So really, it was the sort of post-bankruptcy, post-1975 New York plan. And really, you see Felix Rohatyn and the group of advisors that helps bail New York out, developing this plan to turn property that is not generating tax money into property that is generating tax money. And actually, a lot of the research that I'm doing on these porn parlors shows that it wasn't that they weren't paying property taxes. They were paying property taxes. What they weren't paying taxes on was the income on everything illegal that they were doing. So it was really sort of replacing businesses that were making untaxable income with businesses that are making taxable income. That was a big piece of it. Another big piece of it, frankly, I think lies at the door of the universities. I mean, NYU has destroyed the East Village, not just by putting up its dormitories and so on and so forth, but by bringing so many more students into the East Village and the West Village. And you bring thousands and thousands of undergraduates and graduate students, and, you lose things like places that you can get your shoes repaired, turn into bars. Dry cleaners turn into restaurants. So it's really the shift, the sort of American shift toward a service economy, affected New York dramatically. Nothing is made in Manhattan anymore, and precious little is made anywhere in the five boroughs. Whereas in the 1950s and 60s, you had factories, you had a garment district where they actually made clothes. Right. You had working people, and it started in the Giuliani administration, and it was continued in the Bloomberg administration. New York was turned into a place for tourists, a place that was supposed to draw people who didn't really live there. So you can even see this with the numbers of luxury high-rises that have been built in Manhattan. Most of them, nobody really lives there. The Plaza, for example, was turned into condominiums. They did a story in the New York Times that says there are people who live at the Plaza. Nobody else actually lives on their floor, even though all of those apartments are owned by somebody. So in many ways, New York has kind of turned into one giant investment property, where I think you still see really, in many ways, the old New York is Queens. I mean, you don't even really see it in Brooklyn anymore because Brooklyn has become so Manhattanized. In Queens, you see it in places like Brighton Beach. Like if you go to Brighton Beach and Coney Island and so on, you really see a kind of old honky-tonk New York, immigrant restaurants and immigrant businesses. I mean, there are places in Brighton Beach or places in Sunset Park where you could definitely be in the old Lower Manhattan.
Parallel story there too, and you're thinking about how Manhattan changed, thinking about the death of nightclubs. And how all these great nightclubs I used to go to in the 90s, I mean, never mind Studio 54 back in the late 70s and 80s, are all gone. I mean, because it was, the tax crunch, it was organized crime, and I was reading the story about Studio 54, how they used to pay people in cocaine. You'd get a job there, and they'd say, well, either do you need a W-2, we'll pay you, or we can just give you cocaine.
Right.
What's your choice? And a lot of folks took the coke. They're like, I'll just take the cocaine as payment. It's under the table, and I'll take cash and a bunch of coke every Friday or every Saturday night. But Claire Potter, that's the New Yorker going to the Tunnel, my favorite club, or the Limelight. All those places are gone. Yeah. I mean, it's so many fun nights. They're getting into all sorts of mischief and mayhem and trouble. Like I said, if anything ever happens, they got to clean out the apartment. They'll find out about this dark past that I had. But Claire Potter, as we try not to laugh, where can folks find you online? And if folks want to submit, you're an editor of a book series, never mind your other writings and work. I mean, where can folks find out more about you and how can they reach out to you?
Well, they can reach out to me at clairepotter.com. That's my website. They can also find me at the Tenured Radical at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And then, I've got a book series since 1970, Histories of Contemporary America. I co-edit it with Renee Romano. We published with the University of Georgia Press. And we love to see new material, history after 1970, and we construe the idea of history somewhat broadly to include cultural criticism, American studies, other interdisciplinary fields. And they can also, actually, this is the sort of newest thing, they can also find me at the Humanities Action Lab at the New School, which is where we're developing our new digital humanities minor. Easy to be found. Now, see, you maybe read all the emails. You're like, hey, I read this book and this and that. But I mean, so many things we didn't get a chance to talk to. I was curious, this is where we can sit down again in the future talking about what it's like to edit a line of books and common mistakes that people make in the submissions process. And the other big question, which is why this is such a fun conversation, you always leave something on the table for next time, is thinking about what's going to happen with scholarship in the future when everything is digital. And you you don't have an operating system to run these old programs, and God forbid there's some sort of disaster with an electromagnetic pulse and it's all gone away. I mean, that's more than the basis of a dystopian sci-fi novel. It's something that archivists are struggling with as we speak about how to protect information. So Claire Potter, I just want to thank you one more time for being so generous and so giving with your sharing. Thanks for having me, Chauncey. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. As I said, it's always good to have a dance partner where you're hearing the same music and you can just go. I mean, sometimes you talk to folks, as I say, because I'm still astounded and I'm still amazed by it. There's 6 degrees of separation, maybe 3, and there's a hive mind out there for folk who are interested in these issues. You're talking about similar issues, you're working through ideas, and some conversations are just so easy. And Claire Potter, I mean, what a great conversation partner. And I can't wait to sit down and chat with her again in the future. So I hope you enjoyed that. Again, touched on a lot of stuff. So I'm a Luddite, and I have my cell phone. I'm embarrassed to say this. I got the old throwaway flip phone I got a few years ago. I know AT&T made a ton of money off of me, and I never replaced it because it rings. So then lo and behold, I discover that it costs me a lot more a month for a phone that does nothing than to get a smartphone. So I give in because I don't believe in contracts. I don't lose people money. I go to the Best Buy, and I was like, let me get one of these quote unquote smartphones, and you guys can help me with this because I don't get what the big deal is. So they had one $179.99 on sale for $59.99. I said, there you go. Let's get that. I'm afraid to carry it because I got to get a mail order a case from Amazon and get some covers on the glass, all that good stuff, so I can put music on it. I downloaded some apps. I got a flashlight on there. I got a recorder on there, and I got 2 or 3 games. That's it. I don't see what the point of the thing is. I don't see what people are in love with them. I can put the music on there. Okay, that's good. listen to some great podcasts, look at some websites on occasion. I'm not going to be watching TV on the thing, maybe in bed, because I don't have the TV in the bedroom. I don't believe you should have a TV in the bedroom. I think it's a distraction, especially if you're married or in a relationship. You got folk coming over. Bedtime should be decompression and love time. It shouldn't be TV time. No TVs in the bedroom, and sex therapists have talked about that. TVs in the bedroom are bad for intimacy, bad for communication, and bad for relationships. So if folks can email me, ChaunceyDeVega.com, you know the email, ChaunceyDeVega@gmail.com. Help me see the light about cell phones, these smartphones, because I don't get it. It's heavy, it weighs too much, and I don't get what the appeal of it is. So somebody out there who's not a Luddite can hook a brother up and give him some insight. As I said, we got our little rain in the background, that ambiance here in Chicago. Next episode of the podcast, I got some really cool people, as I said, lined up who I've already chatted with, other folk we'll be talking to in the near future. This was just a gem, a joy. And again, it's another snapshot in time, reaching back to what happened to Mr. Walter Scott. This was recorded on Tuesday, where all that stuff was coming out, and I was just in a moment. And we connect and we chat, and I had a great talk with Kelly Daly, smart sister. She has a YouTube online program. It's sort of her take on the Daily Show, some really good smart stuff. It's called News Hangover, and it's sort of her revisioning, her remaking of the modern newsroom. She has skits. She does comedy. It's infotainment. She has about 16 episodes out, so we connected, and it was just a wonderful conversation. As I said, two fellow travelers. We talked about comedy, politics, how to be funny, because she was a food writer, Stanford grad, did work there, journalist, as I said, covering the restaurant scene out in California. And then lo and behold, she starts to make this transition, working with media, a startup, doing her thing, getting the people, putting the shows together, putting together a writing team. And as I said, cool people, and it's an organic moment. So next week you're going to hear some thoughts in progress. The veil drops and just saying, hey, Kelly, we had this stuff go down with this gentleman who's been killed by these thug killer cops. And what is it like in that moment? Because I'm sure you all have had moments like that too, where you're just processing. So as I said, if podcasting is a type of online journaling and archiving, you get Chauncey DeVega and Kelly just talking about something that happened as it broke, as the news came out. Me sorting through thoughts, her kindly listening, her asking me questions. And then we sort of pivot from there and we talk about, comedy and humor and race and gender and identity. And as I said, the formula of comedy. How do you become funny? There are different types of humor. How do you think about stand-up? And folks who follow me online, you all know that, I'm a student of comedy, fascinated by African-American comedy and its role in the public sphere and the black counterpublic, the Chitlin Circuit, the great truth tellers like Pryor, like Red Fox, George Carlin, Lenny Bruce, Andy Kaufman, so many of the greats, so many greats out there, Paul Mooney. And it's just a good conversation. It's a good conversation. So that's going to be next week on the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. And you can't hide. I'm thinking about the tone of my voice, and you do radio as I did in another life. And you get practice, and then you do the podcast. You learn that your voice is an instrument, but you always have to be yourself. And folks know I say this from pro wrestling. You have to be yourself with the volume turned up. And sometimes with the volume turned up, you're always yourself, because people know when you're a liar. They know when you're insincere. And your voice can't hide that. I mean, maybe the great actors and actresses that can, I guess. But I know I'm feeling what a lot of y'all are feeling. And it's one foot in front of the other on this racism beat. Stay positive. Stay good. Do something indulgent. Don't surrender to the psychic and mental assaults on your well-being. Now, some things we just have to be mindful of. Like I said, me and Nick Childs talked about. The realities of how the police threaten and imperil the lives of people of color and poor people in this country. That's a survival skill. So I'm not saying be a fool, be willy-nilly naive, going out and giving hugs. Be smart, stay safe, understand the law. But as is, my outro, we call it, the closer, the closing, I always implore people, if you can, show some love to the podcast. There are opportunity costs, time, money, resources, energy. I was figuring out, podcast takes about 3 hours a show at least. And we're going to be up to about 50 episodes soon. That's 150 hours at least of labor. And I love it, and it's a labor of love, and I give so much positive energy back out to the kind folks who support the website, especially doing our twice-a-year fundraisers. I've had other advertising offers. I keep saying no. That's the plan going forward unless something ridiculous comes up. So your donations and kindness are always appreciated. I want to thank some kind folk last week who threw in some ducats into the pile. I guess they heard, Friends of Warren heard my insurance or heard my IRS tax refund pleadings like Judge Mathis. So you get a little extra in that tax refund. Throw a brother $5, throw him $10. That's always a big help going forward. I appreciate it very, 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 very much. If you can, please continue to tweet, download, and share the podcast. That will be so appreciated because, again, the momentum is so important. We're close. We're just so close to so many other things in development and in process I can't really talk about yet because I don't want to jinx it, but I think some good stuff is about to happen, and that's all because of you guys. So keep sending me that love like Dusty Rhodes would talk about, my hand to your hand on that TV screen. So do that if you can through the powers of the internets and our interconnected collective subconscious. Send my brother some good energy, and I'll send it forward. As always, please do something nice for a stranger. Call up a friend you haven't spoken to. Look out for our homeless brothers and sisters. Please try to show some love and kindness to our animal friends. Maybe sign up for a charity or volunteer, if you can, to help people. That's always good. But practice self-care and just try to make the world a little better place in your own neck of the woods, and take care of yourself. Breaking my own rule. That's always the last thing I say. There is sort of a format here, but I'm just, always trying to be real and honest and go where my feelings take me. In the summertime, you gotta get in shape. So I'm gonna have you all keeping me accountable. I was trying to watch the waistline this winter. I don't know. I've put on like 5 pounds. I lost some weight and I put on 5. I was posing the other day saying, man, Chauncey, you got to get back into shape, boy. You're not looking bad, but you could be looking a lot better. So I will be in earnest going back. I sort of slacked for a month or two. My Mueller system workout. And I'm a little nervous about it. It's supposed to be good. I finally got it, downloaded it, bought it. Diamond Dallas Page's system, his workout system, sort of aerobic yoga. And I had a friend email me because I get bored with things very quickly. There's apparently a workout that the Canadian Air Force has been doing. Its pilots have been doing for 50 years. So I may start doing that too. Again, looks like a cousin to the Mueller system. So I'm going to be checking in periodically. And no, I'm not going to stop my soda. I'm sick. I can't stop. Help me. I'm like Pookie, New Jack City. And that's why the next week's conversation with Kelly Daly is so cool, because we have some moments there where we both think about and reflect on, it happens organically, about how humor is a type of medicine, and humor and laughter, especially for folk who have been on or been victims of institutional cultural oppression. Sometimes some folk, we're able to laugh to keep from crying. Black and brown folk, the Roma, our Jewish brothers and sisters, the Irish, we can go down the list. We're pretty damn funny people because we got to be funny. That international blues sensibility also has an element of humor to it too. So again, until next time, be good to each other. Be good to your families, be good to your friends, be good to your pets, leave the world a better place, and just try to send some good energy out to, and to all the other families and survivors of police violence and police thuggery and all those others who've been killed by, police vigilantes and those who are identified with them. That's really important. We gotta do that. So one foot in front of the other, guys. Till next time, you've been listening to The Chauncey DeVega Show. Thank you.